The following episode contains mature themes and strong language. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello, welcome to History and Mystery in Kansas City, the history podcast about all things unsolved and unexplained. I am your host, Laura. This episode I wanted to cover Tom Pendergast and John Lazia. These two men helped form Kansas City into what it is today. Some parts are good, and some parts are pretty terrible. The story just covers a sliver of how the Kansas City Mafia began. But before we get into that, the cold case I want to cover is about a young man named Alonzo Brooks. He was a 23-year-old African-American male who went to a party on April 3rd, 2004. It was at a farmhouse on the outskirts of Lazia, Kansas, a small country town. There were about 100 people at this party, and maybe 3 were African-American, including Alonzo. And he was actually half black and half Hispanic. There were several reports about people using slurs and racial comments towards him. He came to the party with his friends, but they had left the party without him. Apparently, Alonzo didn't drive, so he rode with one of his friends to this party. Alonzo lived in Gardner, Kansas, which is about an hour north of where the party was. 40 minutes, hour. According to some witnesses, after Alonzo's friends left, a fight broke out around 3 a.m, maybe over a girl. The KBI and FBI actually got involved pretty early on, which was good. There was a massive search conducted with dogs, helicopters, and even a dive team. They searched the property and the nearby creek and the wooded areas, but there was no sign of Alonzo. And his family actually found the boots and the hat. They were thrown on the side of the road by basically the driveway that goes up to the farmhouse. The police didn't even find those. Some people from the party agreed to take polygraphs, but some refused. They lawyered up and have not spoken about it since. The U.S. Attorney's Office told Fox 23, quote, "From the beginning, there were rumors that Brooks had been the victim of foul play. Some said Brooks may have flirted with a girl. Some said drunken white men wanted to fight an African-American male. And some said racist whites simply resented Brooks' presence." End quote. After he had been missing for almost a month, the family and friends conducted their own search. And they found him in less than an hour, in a pile of branches in the creek. There was no obvious cause of death. The family believes Alonzo was placed in the creek after the search teams were in the area, because his body and belongings were in relatively decent shape for someone who was supposed to be in the water for over a month. He even had papers in his pocket that were still intact. And the people who found him said that he was not bloated like you would be if you were in the water for a month. The dive team swore that they searched that area and he was not there. So there's rumors going around that maybe he was placed somewhere else and then dumped later. That seems like an awful lot of trouble for someone to go through, to hide the body somewhere and then take it back out to the creek. Because if he was out there in the water for that long, he would have been bloated, he would have been discolored, he would have had way more damage to his body. And it was well known that the family and friends were going to do a search that day. So it almost makes you wonder if somebody put him there on purpose for them to find. And that could even mean that it was somebody that loved him or cared about him at some point because they want to give his family his body, or that they have remorse and they feel bad for what happened and they want his family to find him. But who knows? In the 2004 autopsy, it was ruled as undetermined. But in 2020, Alonzo's remains were exhumed. The Armed Forces Medical Examiner completed a second autopsy. And after the second autopsy at the Dover Air Force Base, Alonzo's death was ruled a homicide. The U.S. attorney told NBC, quote, "It defies reason to believe that Alonzo's death was a suicide or that he somehow accidentally tumbled into a relatively shallow creek in Lynn County, leaving behind his boots and hat, all with no witnesses whatsoever," end quote. Alonzo's family believes his murder was a hate crime. His sister Esperanza said, "Just us finding him. It didn't seem that they had done a thorough search. And we just knew there was foul play from the beginning. There was foul play because he would have come home. He's never stayed away from home," end quote. Alonzo was described as a chill guy with a great sense of humor. He loved to have fun and he loved his family. Please contact the authorities if you have any information about that night so the family can get some answers. Alonzo's sister Esperanza said, quote, "Think about it. If that was your family member, you would want somebody to tell you what happened. And to know what happened to bring the murderers to justice. Not only that, there is a big reward out there," end quote. The FBI is offering a $100,000 reward in this case, so anyone with information is encouraged to call the FBI at 816-512-8200 or 816-474-TIPS. Or you can even submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov. If you have not watched the Netflix Unsolved Mysteries reboot, Season 15, Episode 4 features Alonzo's case. Please go check it out because there are so many more details that they cover that I do not have time for here. And also, if you believe you're a victim or a witness of a hate crime, regardless of your national origin or immigration status, the FBI urges you to report the crime by calling the local Kansas City office at 816-512-8200 or submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov. Now let's talk about some Kansas City history and two men who made Kansas City what it is today. For the worst, or maybe the better, who knows. There's so much information about the Kansas City Mafia and how it's formed. This is just a snippet of a large amount of information, and there is absolutely no way to cover it all in one episode. It is essential to talk about it because Kansas City is the way it is now because of its past. Tom Pendergast and the Kansas City Mafia had a great deal of influence on Kansas City and how it ran and grew. I found this quote on the Kansas City Library. The two men responsible for shaping the criminal underworld were Lazia and none other than Tom Pendergast. While the mob might have controlled the North End, Pendergast controlled all of the Kansas City metro by wielding his unchecked political power as Missouri's most prominent Democrat and through his control of Missouri's federal relief welfare program. End quote. Tom Pendergast was born in my hometown, St. Joseph, Missouri, in 1872. He took over the political machine when his older brother, James, died of natural causes in 1911. When James Pendergast was in charge, Kansas City was basically the Wild West. There were gamblers, prostitutes, con men, renegade Native Americans. James had built the machine out of revenue from saloons, gambling, and prostitution. And James had established himself in the West Bottoms area and north of the West Bottoms in neighborhoods of working class people. So it's basically just like an old Western movie that you see with John Wayne. So Tom takes over these saloons, gambling operations, and prostitution rings. He was a member of the city council and a member of the Knights of Columbus. Between 1900 and 1914, Italian and Sicilian immigrants were moving to the area. Most were good, hardworking people, just looking for a better life. But of course, there's always bad eggs. Some of them were predators, people who had been mafia members in their home country. So they started doing what they knew. They began to dominate the North End. They began to gain stature and told Pendergast, if you get us the Italian vote, then we'll protect you. You know, a little, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back kind of deal. One of those Italians was John Lazia, and he was one of the bad eggs. He was born in 1895 in Brooklyn, New York. His family moved to Kansas City's Little Italy in the north end of town. He spent some time in prison, and when he got out, he got into bootlegging and gambling. So it seems like John Lazia and Tom Pendergast are going to be BFFs. When the Great Depression hit, many Kansas City residents were out of work. Pendergast would aid the poor and working class by finding them jobs in exchange for votes, of course. And even though it was during Prohibition, Pendergast bribed the police to allow alcohol, basically turn the other way. Kansas City was a party town. You want a beer? You want alcohol? Come to Kansas City. We got the good stuff. Also, many elections were fixed to keep his friends in power. He was very corrupt, and there were regular shootouts and beatings on election days during his watch. Nightclubs made Pendergast rich, but it also helped artists and musicians get their start. Like Count Basie, Benny Moten, and Charlie Parker. Part of me really wishes I could go back to that time just to go to some of the nightclubs. Can you imagine how fun that would be? I bet it was just banging. In 1928, John Lazia basically tells Tom that they're partners now. Big Boss Tom does not like that idea. But at the same time, he knows that the Lazia crime family is dangerous. So he plays along. I mean, don't get the wrong idea. Tom also likes the idea of having the mob for intimidation. They can get voters to vote in his favor. He also likes that he'll get a chunk of money that the mob gained from its illegal rackets because Boss Tom makes the police look the other way. I mean, he was already corrupt, so what the hell? Around 1931, the Supreme Court gave authority to appoint the Kansas City Board of Police Commissioners to the governor instead of the state like it used to be. So basically, the Supreme Court gives Pendergast and Lazia the police department. On a silver platter, here you go. So Lazia has control of the chief of police. He underpays the current police officers so they would accept bribes. And he hires 140 to 150 ex-felons to be police officers. They protected all of the criminal activity that they were running. Because of all of this, Kansas City became a hot vacation spot for every criminal in the country, like Bonnie and Clyde. Even fugitives could come to Kansas City, just go talk to John Lazia, and they wouldn't be hassled. Around this time, 1932 or so, was when many of the Italian and Sicilian boss families came together, and they formed La Cosa Nostra. Lazia began to feud with other gangsters, so he and his men broke into the armory in Kansas City and stole a shit ton of weapons. In 1933, Lazia provided some of his men to help free a bank robber who was in police custody. The police and prisoner, Frank Nash, were traveling through Union Station and were ambushed. Nash and 4 police officers were killed, and that came to be known as the Union Station Massacre, which I want to cover in a future episode at some point. People in Kansas City were just outraged. So Pendergast decided that Lazia was becoming a liability and wanted him gone. So Pendergast didn't protect him anymore, and John Lazia was indicted for bootlegging, illegal gambling, and tax evasion. He served a year in prison. Pendergast and his politicians started funding Michael LaCapra. LaCapra was a former lieutenant of Lazia's. So Lazia's really feeling betrayed at this point, I bet, because Pendergast and him used to be buds, and now Pendergast isn't protecting him anymore, so he got in trouble. He served prison time, and now Pendergast is backing LaCapra, one of Lazia's former lieutenants. So it's almost like, making out with your best friend's boyfriend. I mean, the betrayal. Pendergast's reach went outside of just Kansas City. He influenced Missouri state politics and Washington, D.C. He supported Harry S. Truman for county judge, and in 1934, Truman was elected to the U.S. Senate. On Historic Missourians, I found this quote: Truman was mocked as the senator from Pendergast because of his ties to the notorious political boss. Truman, however, gained recognition for honesty and hard work in Washington, D.C. According to Maxwell Adler on the Kansas City Library website, Kansas City's voter turnout was suspiciously high during the Pendergast era, sometimes surpassing the number of registered voters. What do you know? The mob would ride around town on election day and make sure you voted for the Democrats. And of course, it was all the people that Pendergast had endorsed. His buddies. The 1934 primary election was so violent, it was known as the Bloody Election. Governor Guy Park was even called in to send the National Guard, but he refused. Even after people were getting shot and killed in the streets, telegrams were being sent to the governor, but he did nothing. At the end of the day, 4 people were killed, 11 people critically injured, and dozens were roughed up, quote unquote. Because the police really did not get involved, Pendergast fired his police chief, who was Eugene Rippert, and hired a former Star reporter named Otto Higgins. Which I'm not sure how that's supposed to make the people in the community feel better, because I'm sure they knew that the police were under Big Boss Tom and his control. Those were his guys, the ones shooting people and beating up everyone. I mean, nothing happened in Kansas City without Boss Tom's say-so. Even the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office and Pendergast were BFFs. Just imagine that you're an everyday citizen heading to the polls to vote. You get there and you see people getting beaten, shot at. I mean, it's madness. When you get to the polls, they ask you in their 1930s mob accent, who are you going to be voting for? Or maybe they say, you're going to vote for Boss Tom, and don't even ask the question. But of course you're going to say, Big Boss Tom. I mean, I'd be walking up to the poll lines in a I Heart Boss Tom t-shirt and waving a flag with his face on it. Even though by this point I'm sure that there were many people who wanted change, their lives depended on giving the vote to Tom. The FBI actually got involved because of suspected voter fraud, and they discovered that at least 95 ballots were fraudulent. In 1937 and 1938, 242 people had pled guilty or been convicted of voter fraud, and this nearly destroyed the Pendergast machine because all of his people were getting put away. On July 10th, 1934, at 3 a.m., Lazia and his wife arrived home at Park Central Hotel. As Lazia was getting out of his car, gunmen with a submachine gun and a sawed-off shotgun came out from the bushes. Those are my dogs, if you can hear that mess. Lazia was hit multiple times and just left on the sidewalk to die. Lazia would actually die at the hospital, but before he died, he asked the doctor, quote, "Doc, what I can't understand is why anybody would do this to me. Why to me, to Johnny Lazia, who has been the friend of everybody?" End quote. Lazia's associates blamed La Cabra, but the police actually traced the bullets in Lazia's body to bullets that were found at Union Station. So the police suspected that it was actually an ally of Lazia who killed him. On August 21st, 1935, La Capra was found shot to death along a highway in New York. So it looks like the Mafia got their revenge. But at the time of the Union Station massacre, La Capra was probably still a lieutenant of Lazia. So maybe it was him. Lloyd C. Stark was elected governor of Missouri in 1936, and he supported Pendergast. But Stark turned on Pendergast and requested that federal authorities begin an investigation into Pendergast's taxes. They found Pendergast had fixed a lawsuit between insurance companies and the state of Missouri for the price of $750,000, and he failed to claim this money on his taxes. So he was charged with tax evasion. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 1 year and 3 months in prison plus 5 years probation. And he was ordered to pay a measly $10,000 fine. Former FBI agent Lear B. Reed was appointed chief of police, and he put a ton of work into cleaning up the crime and corruption in the city. In 1940, there was a movement called the Clean Sweep, where the authorities were cleaning up the city. And there was a women's movement where ladies in the town would wear broom pins and carry brooms to the rallies. It was their way of saying, like, out with this old bullshit, in with the new. The clean sweep meant that the Sicilian and Italian bosses went underground. They were still operating, but just not out in the open. Pendergast died of a heart attack January 26, 1945. He was 72 years old. In 1953, Nick Civella joined La Cosa Nostra, and this is when the organized mafia really began in Kansas City. But that's going to be another story. Like I said, I was just scratching the surface, and I wanted to focus just on these two men. I will definitely have more episodes about the mafia, but it is way too much to cover in 1, 2, or even 3 episodes. After learning about all of this, it's clear that that's why Kansas City had such a big population boom during Prohibition. And that's one reason why the jazz clubs and the nightclubs just went crazy here. And that's why a lot of good jazz artists got their start here, because there was alcohol here. So let's go to the nightclubs that have alcohol. And secondly, we had barbecue. If you want to hear more about Kansas City barbecue history, there's an episode on my Patreon. Do you have any old mobster stories that were passed down to you? I would really love to hear them. And what other types of stories do you want to hear? Any type of mystery or history, of course. Please check out the Facebook page, History and Mystery in Kansas City, where you'll find all of my references, photos, and the information for Alonzo Brooks. You can also donate to the Patreon at patreon.com/historyandmysterykcpod. If you would like to help support the show, it'll keep it going and make it better. And I need to give a shout out to Jada McClintock for joining my Patreon. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening. And until next time, stay aware, alert, and alive.